Horned helmets. Everyone knows what a Viking looks like. Braided beard, round shield, and a helmet with two massive horns. There's just one problem. Not a single horned Viking helmet has ever been found. Archaeologists have excavated hundreds of Viking graves, battlefields, and settlements across Scandinavia, and the helmets they find are simple rounded caps of iron or leather. The horns came from somewhere else entirely, a costume designer. In 1876, Carl Emil Doppler designed the outfits for Wagner's opera Der Ring des Nibelungen, and he gave the Norse characters horned helmets because it looked dramatic on stage. The image was so powerful that it overwrote 1,000 years of actual history. Think about it from a warrior's perspective. You're in a shield wall, bodies pressed together, axes swinging inches from your face. Horns on your helmet would give your enemy two perfect handles to grab your head and snap your neck. No fighter who wanted to survive would wear them. The real Vikings were pragmatists, traders, navigators, and settlers who reached 4 continents with open boats and no compass. The horned helmet tells you nothing about them. It tells you everything about how one good costume can defeat an entire archaeological record. Napoleon's height. The word Napoleon complex exists because everyone knows the French emperor was a tiny, furious man compensating for his size. Except he wasn't. Napoleon stood about 1.69 meters, 5 foot 7, which was slightly above average for a Frenchman of his era. The confusion has 2 sources, and one of them was a weapon. First, France and Britain used different inches. French records listed him at 5 feet 2 in French units, which converts to 5 foot 7 in British ones. Second, British cartoonists, especially James Gilray, deliberately drew him as a screaming toddler in oversized boots. It was wartime propaganda, and it worked so well that 2 centuries later, you still believe it. Picture the scene that fed the myth. Napoleon surrounded by his imperial guard, soldiers selected specifically for being tall. Standing next to men over 6 feet, anyone looks small. His nickname, Le Petit Caporal, wasn't about height either. It was affection from his troops, the way you'd say, the little guy, about someone you love. Napoleon lost at Waterloo, but he lost the propaganda war even harder. The British didn't just defeat him, they shrank him. The flat earth. The story goes that before Columbus, everyone believed the world was a flat disk, and that ships would sail off the edge. It's completely backwards. Educated people had known the earth was round for nearly 2,000 years before Columbus was born. Eratosthenes calculated the planet's circumference in the 3rd century BC using 2 sticks and a shadow, and got remarkably close. Medieval universities taught a spherical earth as standard fact. Kings held an orb in their hand at coronation precisely because it represented the round world. So where did the myth come from? Mostly from one man, Washington Irving, the author of Sleepy Hollow, who wrote a romanticized biography of Columbus in 1828 and invented the scene where scholars mock him for believing the earth is round. It was fiction and it entered textbooks as fact. Here's the irony you were never told. In the actual debate, Columbus was the one who was wrong. The scholars didn't say the earth was flat. They said it was much bigger than Columbus claimed, and they were right. If the Americas hadn't been in the way, Columbus and his entire crew would have starved in an ocean far larger than he calculated. The myth flips the story. The ignorant experts had the correct math, and the visionary got lucky. History remembers the gambler, not the geometry. Pyramid slaves. Hollywood shows tens of thousands of slaves being whipped as they drag stone blocks under the desert sun. Archaeology shows something completely different. In the 1990s, excavations near Giza uncovered the workers' village. Bakeries producing thousands of loaves of bread, breweries, cattle bones from prime cuts of meat, and medical facilities where broken bones had been set and healed. Slaves don't get health care and beef. Then came the decisive discovery, the workers' own tombs, built in the shadow of the pyramids they raised. Being buried near the pharaoh's monument was an honor. No slave would receive it. Imagine yourself as one of those workers. You're a farmer, and the Nile flood has covered your fields for 3 months. The state hires you, feeds you, houses you, and you spend the season hauling stone on a national project. Part paid labor, part civic duty, part religious devotion. Graffiti left inside the pyramids records team names like Friends of Khufu, the ancient equivalent of a crew signing their work. The slave story mostly comes from Herodotus, writing 2,000 years after the pyramids were finished, and from movies quoting Herodotus. The pyramids weren't built by broken people, they were built by organized ones, and organization, not cruelty, is the real engineering marvel. Gladiator deaths. In every film, the arena ends one way. Thumbs down, blade through the chest, crowd roaring. In reality, killing a gladiator was like torching a race car. Gladiators were staggeringly expensive investments. Their owners, the Lanistae, spent years and fortunes on training, food, and medical care. Gladiators ate a specialized diet and were treated by the best doctors in Rome, including Galen himself, who began his career patching them up. A promoter who wanted a death match had to pay the owner the gladiator's full value, so most fights ended with submission, not execution. The numbers back it up. Studies of gladiator records suggest roughly 9 out of 10 fights ended with both men walking out alive. Put yourself in the sand for a moment. You're a gladiator with a fan base, merchandise with your name on it. Children played with gladiator action figures made of clay, and women wore hairpins dipped in your sweat sold as perfume. You're less a doomed prisoner and more a heavyweight boxer with worse job security. Deaths happened, and the profession was brutal. But the arena was a sports economy, not a slaughterhouse. Rome didn't waste its athletes. It marketed them. Let them eat cake. It's the most famous quote of the French Revolution. Told that the peasants had no bread, the queen sneered, then let them eat cake. She never said it. The phrase, qu'ils mangent de la brioche, appears in Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Confessions, attributed to an anonymous great princess, and Rousseau wrote it around 1765, when Marie Antoinette was 9 years old and still living in Austria. The line was a stock anecdote about clueless royalty, decades old, that revolutionaries later stapled to the queen they wanted to destroy. And here's the part that never gets told. Her actual letters show the opposite attitude. During a bread shortage, she wrote to her family that the people's suffering obligated the royal family to work harder for them. That doesn't make her a saint. Her spending was real, and the monarchy's failures were real. But watch what the myth does. It takes a complicated, unpopular foreign queen and compresses her into a single sentence of cartoon evil. That's the mechanism of political memory. Revolutions don't just execute people. They write their dialogue afterwards. The Library of Alexandria. The story says a single catastrophic fire destroyed the greatest collection of ancient knowledge, setting humanity back 1,000 years. The truth is slower and sadder. The library didn't die in one night, it declined over centuries. Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BC damaged part of the collection, but the library kept operating for generations afterwards. The real killers were budget cuts, purged scholars, political instability, and simple neglect. Membership privileges were revoked, funding dried up, the daughter library was destroyed in religious conflicts, and by late antiquity there was little left to burn. Think of what that means for you, standing in the ruins. There was no dramatic moment to resist, no single villain to blame. Each generation just decided the library mattered slightly less than the last one did. And the lost knowledge itself is partly myth. Most important works existed in copies across the Mediterranean. What survived elsewhere survived, and what was mostly lost everywhere for the same boring reasons. Nobody kept copying it. The lesson isn't about fire. Civilizations rarely lose knowledge in flames. They lose it in budget meetings. The 300 Spartans, Thermopylae, 300 warriors against the entire Persian Empire, except the Greek force at the pass numbered around 7,000 Thespians, Thebans, Corinthians, and troops from a dozen other cities. Plus hundreds of helots, the enslaved laborers Sparta brought to war, and history rarely counts. Even on the famous last day, when the position was compromised and most of the army withdrew, the Spartans didn't stand alone. 700 Thespians chose to stay and die beside them, their entire city's fighting force. And they are almost never in the movie. Why does the myth erase them? Because Sparta was history's first great self-marketing state. The Spartans cultivated their own legend deliberately. The one-liners, the discipline, the come and take them, and later writers in love with the brand cropped everyone else out of the frame. Stand at the pass as a thespian for a second. You're about to die for Greece, and history will spend 2,500 years crediting someone else. Thermopylae was real heroism, but the number 300 isn't a fact. It's a logo. White statues. Walk through any museum and classical antiquity looks like an ocean of pure white marble. And entire theories about Greek purity and restraint were built on that whiteness. But the statues were painted loudly. Analysis under ultraviolet light reveals traces of pigment on almost every classical sculpture. Red hair, blue garments, golden armor, patterned fabrics, painted eyes staring back at you. The Greeks and Romans lived in a riot of color. The paint simply flaked off over 2,000 years of burial and weather. The myth hardened during the Renaissance, when artists dug up the faded originals, assumed white was the intent, and made whiteness itself the standard of classical beauty. When researchers later found paint traces, some early archaeologists actually scrubbed them off. The color didn't match the antiquity they'd already decided to believe in. Picture yourself in ancient Athens for a moment. The Parthenon frieze above you in blue and gold, statues with warm skin tones and colored robes, closer to a comic convention than a mausoleum. The white marble ideal isn't ancient at all. We didn't inherit antiquity's taste. We inherited its erosion and called it style.